And thank you to everyone who's taken the time to join us today. I think Claire mentioned that we are doing a recording as well, though, for those who might not be able to attend for the full session or for people who aren't able to attend today. So just be aware that any questions are being recorded. Before we begin, I just want to give a quick land acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge that I am speaking to you today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. My co-presenter, Jennifer Barbosa, is actually located in Kamloops, and she'll be joining us from the Tecumloops-Te-Secwepemc territory. The BC Lottery Corporation operates throughout British Columbia, which is home to over 200 distinct First Nations. We recognize their inherent Indigenous rights and title, the implementation without qualification of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and our support for the 94 calls to action by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So just a little bit about what we're going to go through today, and it's going to be a quick flyby because we've only got an hour, but we do have a bit of a Q&A session at the end. But if you do have burning questions along the way, do feel free to sort of interrupt us as we go, and we'll try to talk quickly in between. So as you can see from today's agenda, we're focusing on the board's role in purpose, strategy, and risk management. And initially, I had planned to speak only on the topics of strategy and risk management, but I realized that we were missing a step because a board-approved corporate purpose is sort of your North Star or guiding light for the board and for management to co-develop the corporate strategy. So we really needed to look at that piece first. We're also going to talk a little bit about innovations that BCLC is using in purpose, strategy, and risk management to deal with the accelerated pace of change. We're all dealing with this. I'll touch on this a little bit, the sort of macroeconomic factors affecting everyone. The types of innovations we're going to talk about today are by no means an exhaustive list. The idea is to kind of spark a conversation about the ways we can guide our boards differently than we might have in the past. And especially for those of us who are long-term practitioners, to be open to new ideas and innovations. So I want to say very humbly and sincerely that none of the ideas I'm presenting today were mine. I didn't originate any of them. So I've often said that governance professionals are like the wind beneath the wings of good governance. We find ways to bring good ideas to life, but we have to stop, and when those ideas are presented to us, just take a few minutes to think about the merits and the pros and cons and, well, how could we execute this? I mean, we're all practitioners, we're all deeply pragmatic, and we're the ones who are going to be able to hopefully take the step-to-step processes to actually bring each of these ideas to life. So moving on, I have brought up a screenshot here with contact details for both myself and my co-presenter, Jen Barbosa. She actually gets all credit for this gorgeous presentation deck. She put together the slide deck. We've got our LinkedIn details there. We've got our email. You are more than welcome to contact us if you want to screenshot this and contact us later. If you have any questions following on from the session, please feel free to do so.
Excuse me, Christine. I'm just going to mute everybody because there's a bit of background noise. I just want to make sure I don't mute you as well. So if I do, just hang on one sec, okay? I will mute everybody.
Sounds good.
Okay. So you just need to unmute yourself. There we go.
There.
Okay.
And we're back.
Sorry about that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fine. I appreciate all the interest, actually. We have nearly 100 participants today, so thank you everyone for taking the time to join. All right, so I wanted to talk a little bit about why BCLC. So the BC Lottery Corporation is a commercial crown corporation. So we sort of straddle two worlds to a certain extent. We're obviously a public sector organization in that we're a crown, which means that all of our profits go back to the provincial government. But we have to operate as a bit of a commercial enterprise. That's the commercial part of the commercial crown corporation. So I like to say that we're a little bit private sector, a little bit public sector. And when I use the term public sector in this context, I'm really talking about government entities as opposed to public reporting companies. So just so that that's not confusing for you. And private sector, of course, I'm talking about for-profit corporations for the most part. So BCLC is one of the top 5 provincial crowns in British Columbia based on incoming revenues. As I mentioned, our net income goes back to the provincial government, where it's used to fund health programs and important services across the province. We also, the provincial government also shares 7% of its receipts from BCLC with the First Nations. We've received a number of awards over the years, but I wanted to put up a few relevant ones that are specific to our talk today. So we've got the World Lottery Association certification. We have level 4 certification for excellence in responsible gambling programming, and that speaks to our mandate. So our mandate is to conduct and manage gambling responsibly in British Columbia. So we're recognized worldwide for that. I've also posted the BC Top 50 Employer Award, which we won again in 2023, if you saw the Vancouver Sun article a couple of days ago. One of the reasons I wanted to touch on this is we were recognized in 2023 for our remote work program, which was something that was developed and arose due to the COVID pandemic. We did not have remote work or hybrid work prior to that. I'm going to ask Jen to speak a little bit to the PwC risk management program effectiveness and maturity rating. If you're able to come off mute, are you able to, Jen?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so last year, BCLC, our enterprise risk management function for the organization, was assessed in terms of its overall effectiveness and maturity in relation to other organizations that are similar to ours. And what we achieved was the top 15% of like organizations. So just in terms of our overall risk management program, which is quite it's quite impressive. And we've grown a lot in this area over the past, I would say, 4 years. So maybe about 4 years ago, we wouldn't have been in the top 15, but we're pretty proud.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chris.
And I really want to pat Jen on the back for that one as well, because it's almost entirely due to her efforts that we're there.
Oh, thank you.
So yes, she was a one-person team for a long time and has built out our enterprise risk management services team over the course of the past few years, and obviously done a beautiful job. So I've also listed here our Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Award. So the reason I highlighted this one is because our emphasis on DIB, along with our remote work program, is what has helped us to offset the impact of the Great Resignation that everyone's being hit with. So our turnover and our hiring rate is just as good now as it was pre-pandemic. And a lot of organizations can't say that. And I think it is due to our focus and our ability to be nimble through all the changes that have occurred over the past few years. And the final one is the Corporate Knights Platinum rating. And I put this one up because we're going to be talking about purpose a little bit today. So we received a platinum rating from Corporate Knights due to the effective implementation of our social purpose. And when we are hiring new employees in, we do the interviews and we ask them what attracted them to BCLC. They consistently say 2 things. One is the work-life balance that we can get through the remote work program, and 2 is our social purpose program. So really quick recap, because I think everybody knows all of this, frankly. Most people on this call are going to be familiar with what we've been enduring over the past 3 years. But as I note here, we have an unprecedented rate of change happening right now with the global disruption. We've got obviously the COVID pandemic, there's been cyber attacks on infrastructure, we've got supply chain issues, the Great Resignation, rising inflation, the war in Europe, which has resulted in sanctions, which has impacted a lot of businesses, our high fuel prices, our extreme weather events, it goes on. And it doesn't seem to be slowing down. The other thing that's impacting and I think driving innovation in corporate governance are the shifting governance models that have occurred. And I notice this in particular because I've been practicing for over 20 years. So I'm very familiar with the old shareholder primacy model and noting all of the differences as we move into more of a stakeholder primacy model. So just to recap, as everyone knows, under Canadian corporate law, board members have a fiduciary duty to act honestly, in good faith, and in the corporation's best interest. How we translate that in the past was we looked to the corporation's shareholders as the primary beneficiaries. So boards focused on maximizing the benefit to shareholders. That was our shareholder primacy model. That model came under fire through a number of things that occurred. But most recently with the tech bubble bursting in 2002 and then the financial crisis in 2008. Out of those two things, we had our Supreme Court of Canada cases of Wise in 2004 and, as most people I think know, BCE in 2009. So the courts evolved the corporate law principles to let boards start to consider various stakeholder interests. They kept it very permissive. It was not mandatory, but we're continuing to move in that direction. In 2019, the federal government actually codified the principles of being able to consider impacts on your various stakeholders under Section 122 of the Canada Business Corporations Act. And there's a movement, we actually have, I think, a link in our resources at the end of the deck as well, to David Suzuki Foundation report that just came out that's looking at evolution in corporate law, and which is advocating for us to move even further in the Canada Business Corporations Act towards the stakeholder primacy model in the same direction as the European Union, and I think France are the two that have kind of been leading the charge on this. So just at a very high level, we're going to talk about practical steps because we're all governance professionals. We're very, very pragmatic that we can take to kind of deal with this rapid pace of change, the change in the governance model, but also improve board management relations and facilitate good decision-making, because that's the bottom line in everything we do. We hope to talk a little bit about how this new stakeholder primacy model can work out in practice. And we're also going to talk about how this rapid pace of change has been driving innovation. So when I talk about the shifting governance model, I just want to talk also as well about some of the really key reports that have been coming out just within the past few years. Again, like I say, this is a really exciting time to be in governance. So ISO 37000 is our first international standard on good governance, the first sort of benchmark. Many of you will be familiar with the 360-degree governance report that came out from Sarah Kaplan and Peter Day, following on from Peter Day's seminal report many years ago on, talking about where are board members in a time of crisis sort of thing. So the most recent report to come out has been the TMX and ICD report in December on the future of Canadian governance. So all of these are highly relevant to Canadian corporate governance. And we're like I say, we're seeing kind of a unprecedented rate of change in terms of governance models and governance thought processes. So as I note here, in terms of purpose, the ISO 37000 really focuses on the board's responsibility to develop a meaningful and relevant organizational purposes, and it'll be relevant in your circumstances in your industry. So the purpose communicates the value that the organization is going to generate for specified stakeholders. And so, like I say, we're not just talking about advancements that have occurred in the courts or advancements that have occurred in our legislation, but we're also seeing it come through in some of these leading governance reports as well, where the focus is on stakeholders as opposed to shareholders as in the past. And under the 360-degree governance report, of course, they talk about how important it is that boards should identify, disclose, regularly review the purpose of the corporation. So if you haven't looked at it in quite some time, now's the time. And I think it is really difficult for a board to actually fulfill its fiduciary duty if you don't understand the purpose or why the corporation exists. So that purpose is your starting point for when you're developing out your strategy. And as you know, probably the strategy is co-developed as between boards and management. So we talk about how the board should direct and engage with the strategy to fulfill the purpose. So if you don't have a good understanding of your purpose, you're not going to have an effective strategy. And that purpose, hopefully, as I've mentioned before, is going to take into account your various stakeholders. So it all kind of ties these disparate threads together. And then the latest report, the TMX and ICD report on the future of Canadian governance, they talk about the board's #1 responsibility is to sort of challenge and ultimately approve the strategy in a way that creates value for all stakeholders, not just for shareholders. So it's a common theme running through all of our most recent governance reports. So boards have to consider whether the corporate strategy is aligned with the company's stated purpose. And I found it really interesting that this isn't just, coming out in our Canadian corporate governance reports. So if you look at the US Business Roundtable's Principles of Corporate Governance, as well as the 360-degree governance report here in Canada, as well as the international standard, all three of them emphasize that your corporate strategy has to build sustainable long-term value. And there's a lot of discussion about this, but whenever I read sustainable, I also think in terms of ESG. Because that's really what the ESG is meant to do, is to build that sort of long-term sustainable value. You want to take into account a variety of stakeholders, but you also want to advance the corporation's purpose. So now I'm going to pass it over to Jen to talk a little bit about the risk management piece.
Perfect. Thanks, Chris. So in a nutshell, effective risk governance is a crucial element of risk management, and it involves the creation and the implementation of policies, procedures, and controls, all of which are used to identify, assess, and manage risks that an organization faces. BCLC has adopted ISO 31000, which is a globally recognized international standard that provides the guidelines and principles for effective risk management. The standard emphasizes the importance of integrating risk management into the organization's overall governance, strategy, and decision-making processes. It also promotes a proactive approach to risk management that really focuses on identifying and mitigating risks before they occur. More specifically, risk governance helps to ensure that the organization's risk management strategies and the decisions that they make align with its objectives and values, and that the risks are managed within appropriate levels of risk. And this is often referred to as, risk limits or levels. You'll hear the terms risk appetite and tolerance. These are terms that are used interchangeably. They do have slightly different meanings, but those meanings are defined by the individual organizations. So risk limits are board approved, and they provide a clear guideline for management in terms of the acceptable levels of risk exposure for an organization, as well as sort of the parameters, if you will, for risk taking and risk mitigation. This ensures that the organization's risk management strategies are consistent with its overall strategy and objectives. So maybe just kind of step back and to sort of sum it up, really by integrating risk governance into the overall management and decision-making processes of an organization, the organization can effectively manage its risks, it can reduce potential losses, and it can protect its assets and reputation. It also enables the organization to be proactive in identifying and responding to emerging risks, and to continuously improve its risk management practices. Thanks, Chris.
Excellent. Thanks, Jen. I appreciate it. So moving on to the practical examples. So how do we get there from here? This is the tricky part. We all know what the macroeconomic factors are. We all know what's driving sort of innovation in terms of our corporate governance model and this push for stakeholders in particular to be heard and to be incorporated into all of our purpose, our strategy. How do you get there? So first off is, as I said, the first step is really purpose before we even get to the strategy piece. So what BCLC did was we underwent a really lengthy process of sort of assessing, developing, eventually adopting what we consider to be a stakeholder-centric social purpose to sort of replace what was our traditional shareholder-centric mission. And I've got up on the screen right now what our old mission used to be. And it's not a bad mission. We operate gambling responsibly for British Columbians. The problem with it is it's kind of obvious. It's really the reason that we exist, or the reason we were created, as opposed to the reason we currently exist. The purpose that we developed was one that took an extensive length of time. It took us over a year. And it started with a board education session. And I was surprised actually at how quickly all of our board members got on board, so to speak, with the idea of developing a social purpose for the organization. Like even our most conservative board members could see the value in developing a new purpose that took into account our various stakeholders and tried to give us a sort of a new guiding light to deal with all of the change. Very quickly thereafter, we adopted a strategic vision to become a social purpose company, made it official, so to speak, and gave tone from the top, and signaled to the entire organization that this was the path we were going to go on. Then we hired, the company hired a social purpose executive, and that was actually one of the goals under our corporate strategy. And we actually hired somebody who was quite experienced in this area. So Peter Terween came to us from Mountain Equipment Co-op, and he's our Chief Social Purpose Officer and our VP of Stakeholder Engagement. So we also established a board committee to oversee the social purpose, and we already had an existing governance committee, so it became our governance and social purpose committee. Then we went through extensive stakeholder consultation. When I say stakeholder consultation, I mean we spoke to representatives from government, and when I say we, I'm using the collective we here, obviously. It was quite a big lift for Peter Terween's team. But what they did was they did consultations with government representatives, with employees internally, with service providers, with vendors. We had focus groups. It was really, really like a lengthy and involved process. And we spoke to as many of our stakeholders as we could. First, about the whole idea of developing a social purpose. Like, does that seem like a good idea? Are you on board with it? And then also talking a little bit about what it might look like at the end of the day, what the wording would look like. And then we actually had 2 different consulting firms provide us with draft wording options. So although it looks very simple on the page, every one of these words was very carefully analyzed and thought through. So the board ultimately approved our purpose of existing to generate win-wins for the greater good. And the generating win-wins was thought to cover a number of things. So we want any interaction that we have, whether it's with a vendor or service provider, with an employee, a customer, with government, with any of our stakeholders, to feel like a win-win, which is a bit of a challenge when you're a gaming and gambling company, because somebody always loses, in the sense of, they may lose money on a given bet that they've made. But we want them to feel like they win at the end of the day. They have a great experience. We're also looking at ways that we can improve our customer value proposition, so that when people do win, like lottery winnings or what have you, they may have an option, for example, to give some of those to charity. We're trying to find different ways to be innovative in that space. And for the greater good, we wanted it to be really clear that when we are generating these win-wins, we want them to be for everyone, and not necessarily just within British Columbia, although that is our primary area that we are, it's our jurisdiction where we're working. It's also where our net incomes and revenues go. But we have service providers, we have vendors that are outside of British Columbia, and we want to be generating win-wins for them as well. So they really thought through and hammered out the language on this one. There was a lot of back and forth discussion on that. So that wasn't the end of the story. Once we had the social purpose in place, then management had to develop an implementation plan to make sure that it got embedded throughout the organization and was included as part of our decision-making and thought processes around all of our various interactions. So including our procurement process, our RFPs, all of that. We had questions around social purpose for our service providers, our vendors. What are they doing in the ESG space? And not in a judgmental way, I would say, but more in an uplifting way. How can we support you? How can we help you on your journey? That sort of thing. And then we had quarterly reports against this social purpose implementation plan as well. So once we had the purpose in place, we had our guiding light. We're ready to start looking at, refreshing our strategy. The problem that we were finding is that your corporate strategy, the one that board approves, is usually the long-term value strategy. So it's usually the one that's 3 to 5 years. And the problem is, with this rapid pace of change, we've got strategic initiatives, programs, things coming up that weren't contemplated in the original 3 to 5 year corporate strategy, but we may actually want to have board input on. So we had to come up with a structure and a process for dealing with these kinds of new and arising strategic initiatives. So we, again, made some changes to our board committee structure. So our former strategy and risk committee, and I have to give credit, by the way, to our board chair for this. This was his idea. It was brilliant. So we took our former strategy and risk committee and reformed it as a strategy and risk committee of the whole. And I have to say, I had to take a moment when I first heard that to say, what is that exactly? It's not something I was very familiar with from my old dealings in the private sector. So a strategy and risk committee of the whole, it is a real thing. It's in Robert's Rules of Order. It's something that's more often used in municipal government settings, for example. And it's a committee, actually acts as a committee, does not do approvals. It's mainly discussion, but it's comprised of the full board, like all board members. And what we did was we would have this committee meet for about a half day, about 1 week before the board meeting would happen. And I know what some of you are thinking, because I was thinking the same thing at the time, which was, well, wasn't that just another board meeting? Why would you have a board meeting before the board meeting? Well, there were several advantages to this, actually. So number one, it is a committee. It is not a board meeting. So no actual approvals can happen, which takes a lot of the pressure off. So what this meant was that anytime there was like a strategic initiative coming forward, it would come to this committee first, 1 week before the board meeting. There'd be a full discussion occurring in a relatively low pressure environment in that there's no approval at the end of that meeting, where management and the board can have a real drill down and a real conversation about whatever strategic initiative they're working on. And the advantage of doing that a week before the board meeting, of course, was that there was time for management to incorporate any changes that needed to be done prior to the final approval at the board. We also adjusted our committee terms of reference, and I'll give you a sample in the next slide. So we needed to come up with a way of assessing these new strategic initiatives that were coming down the pipe and figuring out whether this was something that actually needed board oversight or not. So this actually was kind of ground up. Management formed a cross-disciplinary working group, which I chaired, to develop a framework for assessment of these new strategic initiatives. And the framework was meant to kind of suss out what are the really critical issues from the board perspective that might be impacted by the various strategic initiatives that are coming forward. Such that you would want to have either board approval or board monitoring. If there wasn't that kind of an impact at a high level, and this will make more sense in the next slide, then the strategic initiative can be completely run by management. It can be, board approved, management approved, management monitored. So once we had this framework in place, then we underwent an initial assessment of, believe it or not, 16 significant activities that were currently underway at the organization to try to assess whether those were activities that needed board oversight, approval, monitoring, what have you. So this is a sample only that I brought up. The actual grid that we use is proprietary. So, but I wanted to give you a flavor for how you can do this kind of an assessment at your own organization. And what you'll notice here is on the x-axis, a lot of what you're seeing are stakeholders, basically stakeholder groups. You've got shareholders, vendors, employees, customers. We talk a little bit about revenue and social purpose as well. Those of you who are very familiar with risk management will not be surprised by this grid. It'll look a lot like what you use for risk assessments, where you're looking at impact versus likelihood. So when we have a new strategic initiative coming down the pipe, management does the first assessment. They look at it, they say, okay, what is the impact on each of these stakeholder groups or on our revenue, our social purpose, what have you? Do we assess it to be minor, moderate, major, very significant? That assessment is then brought forward to the board, where they review and either agree with management's assessment and then proceed, or they may actually kick back and say, well, no, I actually think this impact is going to be significantly higher. So as I've noted there, and you're welcome to take a screenshot of this because it's just a sample. If one or more criteria are rated very significant, then board approval and oversight is required. If one or more of these criteria on the left-hand side are rated as major, but none are very significant, then it's management approval, but board oversight going forward. So we want to have ongoing reporting on a quarterly basis from management on how it's going with that particular initiative. And then, as I mentioned, if all the criteria are rated sort of moderate or lower, then the approval and the oversight both remain with management. So I was asked to give a bit of an example on this one. And the best one I could come up with was remote work. So when we were trying to decide at BC Lottery Corporation whether or not to go to a remote work program, management initially felt like this was something that management would just run with. Approval, monitoring, oversight, what have you. The board had a different perspective on it because this was a complete change in the way that we operate our business. It can impact our culture, it can impact training. So from the board's perspective, this was seen as a very significant shift. If we had had this assessment process in place when we were first bringing in our hybrid or remote work arrangement, it would have been a very slam dunk, oh, wait, no, this has to go to the board and this has to be considered at the board level. Because we didn't have our assessment process in place at that time, there was a lot of back and forth, and it took several meetings for management and board to come to a consensus on how to deal with remote work. And I will pass it over to Jen to talk to you a little bit about risk management.
Okay, great. So in addition to the governance amendments that you're seeing on the slide, BCLC has implemented several innovative risk management practices to identify, assess, and manage risks. I'll kind of touch on a few that I think are quite relevant. So we have implemented an integrated risk management framework, and that really brings all the aspects of risk management together, including strategic risks, operational risks, financial and compliance risks. These really, by doing this approach, really enables us to identify and manage risks holistically and across the organization rather than in silos. By doing this, it helps us avoid blind spots and unexpected surprises. We've also adopted an agile approach to risk management that allows for continuous risk assessment, monitoring, and mitigation. This enables us to respond quickly to emerging risks and adapt our risk management strategies as needed. We've also established a risk culture that encourages collaboration and communication among all stakeholders, including employees, vendors, and partners. This approach helps us to identify risks that may not be apparent to one individual or department, and it facilitates effective risk management. So what's next for us is advanced analytics. So we are in the process of going to market for a GRC tool, and this really will enable the risk function along with other functions to analyze vast amounts of data and identify potential risks. This will help us in proactively identifying risks, prioritizing them, and allocating resources and the needed investments needed to manage them. Overall, I would say BCLC's innovative risk management practices really has helped us to become, I would say, an organization that is well positioned to manage its risks and protect its assets and reputation.
Yeah, and I can't emphasize that enough, especially in this rapid pace of change with all of the different macroeconomic factors hitting us, you really need to have a really robust risk management framework and be thinking in terms of how these various risks are going to be impacting your organization. We're in a high risk environment right now, and no business can sort of sit still in this sort of environment. You have to be able to take calculated, intelligent risks, and you can't do that without a really strong risk management team advising you on that.
Yeah, and I would say, like, again, it's just being really, I would say, adaptable to your program needs to adapt to your organization's needs and the changing environmental conditions. So you need to be agile. You need to be flexible.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about how innovation can add value. And like I say, it's especially in corporate governance, there's a tendency to want to do things as we've always done them. I know that's true for myself as well. But innovating or opening yourself up to new ideas can be really exciting, but it can also add tremendous value to your organization. So when we brought in our social purpose, for example, it really enhanced employee engagement very directly, because amongst other things, we were doing these big town halls and these consultation attempts with our various employees to find out how they felt about the social purpose. We found we had a stronger focus on ESG matters because we were already in that headspace where we were thinking in terms of, well, how do we generate a win-win for the greater good? And when you're thinking about the greater good, you're going to be thinking about, how are you ensuring that you've got, good social benefits that you're providing in various strategic initiatives, for example. So we've had, as I mentioned before, an ability to offset the Great Resignation through both our flexibility around work-life balance, our remote work program, and also the social purpose has really been a driver. We're noticing, especially for younger demographics, but across the board, that people really want to work for an organization that they feel is doing greater good in the world. So I think I've mentioned this before, the vendors and service providers that we work with, when we ask them questions around, well, what are you doing in the ESG space? Or what are you doing? Do you have a purpose? What is your purpose? It sort of inspires and empowers them. What we find a lot of times is that they're already doing some good things, but they're not publicizing them. They may not be on their public websites. They may not be talking about them. And by starting that conversation, we're creating a bit of a ripple effect. And we're really noticing improved stakeholder engagement. And this is obviously critical when you're moving into the stakeholder primacy model. How do you cater to your various stakeholders? Well, you're going to have to engage with them. You're going to have that discussion. You're going to have to know what's important to them before you can actually meet their needs. And in terms of the strategic initiatives and the innovations we've been talking about there, having this new improved process has increased collaboration between management and the board. By having this separate strategy and risk committee of the whole that meets before the board meeting, we have more time for discussion, and that's very desperately needed when you've got these kinds of new strategic initiatives happening, when you've got such a rapid pace of change, that sort of thing. We also found that developing the framework, that assessment process, really helped clarify what our board's priorities were, what they were really focused on, and what they really wanted to have input on as well. So as I mentioned, it sort of improved board management relations, but we've also had more comprehensive strategic initiatives. More dialogue means that we are able to get deeper into the details, not necessarily into the weeds, so to speak, but just to build out more robust strategic initiatives that take all of the factors into account. And I'll let Jen speak to the risk management piece here.
Yeah, so I've touched on a lot of this already, and so really, I would just say, sort of in a nutshell, all of the things that we have done in terms of, governance changes, reporting changes, as well as, I would say, developing new policies and practices with our approach to risk management has really resulted in not only the improvement in our risk assessments as a whole, It's driving better decision making. We're quite, I would say, transparent in our organization when it comes to identifying and communicating risks with the right stakeholder groups, where, you know, I would say in traditional risk management, you wouldn't have that view, nor would you have that collaboration. And I think all of these things as a whole will build resilience within the organization if a major event were to happen.
Excellent. And I talked a lot at the beginning of the presentation, so I get to pass it over to Jen for the end of the presentation.
Okay. Great. Well, I think I'm going to probably skip this slide just in the spirit of time, because we want to allow for some questions. So I think we've chatted a bunch on this kind of stuff just right at the beginning in terms of our environmental and macro sort of events that are occurring. Maybe we'll skip to the next slide, if you will. Perfect. So as you can sort of see on this slide, boards and management really do need to adjust. I would say their attitudes and beliefs towards managing risks to be more sort of proactive and forward thinking and really agile. So what I want to focus on in this slide is like, well, how can that be accomplished? Firstly, that is by moving away from a siloed view of risk management to a more integrated and holistic approach that considers sort of the interplay between different types of risks and the potential impacts on the organization as a whole. Secondly, it would be by accepting that there will be an element of uncertainty in the current environment and being prepared to make decisions and take actions, even in the absence of complete information. I would say thirdly, through encouraging creativity and innovation in risk management and being open to new ideas and approaches to addressing risk. That's a pretty important one. I would also say focusing on agility. And you've heard me talk about agility a lot today, but it's really focusing on agility and the ability to quickly adapt to changing circumstances rather than relying solely on traditional risk management processes is pretty crucial. And lastly, building resilience into the organization's risk management strategies to better prepare for future disruptions and challenges is also important with sort of shifting, I would say, the thoughts and beliefs within risk management.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jen. So we're going to try and give some time now for Q&A. I'm actually going to leave our slide deck on the references here so that you can take time to screenshot. What we've got listed in our references are, one is a really good article I found from Norton Rose, a law firm, that talks about the shift to the stakeholder primacy model. But I've also given you links here to the 360-degree governance report, ISO 37000, the latest TMX and ICD report, as well as that David Suzuki Foundation report that talks about new directions in Canadian law, in particular around adjustments to Section 122 of the Canada Business Corporations Act. And then PwC came out with a great article on 4 areas to watch in 2023. Which I thought was very on topic as well. So again, feel free to screenshot all of these references, and we put the full links in there to make it easier for you to find. So I'm just checking. I don't think we have anything in the chat, but please feel free to come off mute. I think people are able to do that now, Claire, correct?
Yes, they should be able to. We have one question asking if they can receive the slides and the recording.
Yeah, the recording for sure. I think the slides, but I'll talk to Jen about that because I don't think we talked about that beforehand.
Sure. Yes.
Does anyone have any other questions around how this might play out in your organization, or if you have any other examples of things that maybe your organization is doing? Oh, there's something in the chat. No, we don't have any questions there. Don't be shy.
It was such a great presentation, Chris, that covered it all.
Oh, I don't know. I would you know me, I like to have questions. So
Yeah.
oh, something I think is coming up.
Yeah.
Can we comment on resourcing and costs related to this program? So I think it depends on which program you're talking about. Are you, Tyler, are you able to give a little more detail there, or do you want to come off mic and speak as well? You're welcome to.
Yeah, sure, Christine. Yeah, I was just curious I mean, we're going through a bit of a, we're not, so I'm in the CPG world and I lead our risk management program, but, very different kettle of fish versus our Crown Corp operating the lottery world. So I don't think, and I fully support the purpose view is great. And we've just gone through 3 years ago, we did a big purposing exercise and we've got McKinsey going to do some work on that front too. But yeah, there's always a trade-off, right? In terms of practicality around this, the resourcing, internal versus external. Just wondered, I know you didn't talk about it as part of the presentation, but not a dollar, but like what's the lift, right, to get this thing off the ground?
Yeah, I think Jen, he's talking about the risk management program. So I think this one's for you.
Yeah, so I would say it's going to obviously be very unique to your own organization, but I would say that really, the rubber hits the road for me in terms of what is the question that you're ultimately you need to ask is what is the value to your executive and the board and the rest of the organization in, I would say, building a risk program that meets their needs. And if you, under-resource it, you're not going to be able to, I would say, effectively embed the practices, proper risk practices throughout the organization. I started out, and Chris had talked about this at the beginning of the presentation, as a one-person department, and I also have corporate insurance underneath me. So that in and of itself is a risk. If one person who really is kind of, I would say, implementing risk in the organization, but also the one doing the risk assessments and other things. I have today a team of 5, including myself. So, cost-wise, I have, 3 senior managers and a manager. We are looking to implement, I would say, some technology. It's a GRC tool to help, I would say, drive some efficiencies. It's really, the bigger part of implementing, a tool is also to just get better analytics, better reporting, that sort of thing. It really is tough to sort of to answer sort of what the investment would look like, because I think it ultimately comes down to what does the organization need and want in its risk management program, and is the current, I would say, what you currently have meeting their needs, and if it's not, then they've got to invest, or it's not, you're not going to be able to deliver on what their expectations are. I hope that answers it.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jennifer. That's kind of what I would expect as an answer. And I think it's fit for purpose, right? Absolutely. And a lot of it's board driven, right? In terms of their experiences and expectations, that they drive the bus on a lot of this too.
Yeah, you make a really good point. I would say that when there is that, the sweet spot is when you do start to get investment and you do get the resources you need to be able to do the work that really helps drive decisions and helps, I would say, the organization in delivering on its strategic initiatives. That's when you actually start to see the work come out of a risk function really shine through. So the more that the risk function is able to produce work to really help drive these big strategic decisions, more investment will happen. It naturally happens because the demand for your services go out through the roof. And that's what has happened to my function, is we can't keep up with the demands in terms of, the work that the board and the executive want us to do. So we're trying to find some creative ways to actually, I would say, train folks within the organization so they can do some of the work on their own, and we're there to consult and advise.
That's great. Thanks, Jen.
Not to hog the line, but just one lever we use is, strategy and risk are two sides of a coin, right? That's kind of all that pitch. So when we do strategic planning and we have pre-reads out to the board in advance of the actual session, risk management is part of the pre-read. So we want to demonstrate that we're looking at opportunities and risk relative to key strategies, right? We want to embed it. And that's been a great way, to your point, of making it less about a separate program and really kind of building it from purpose into strategy, into objectives, into performance management, and embedding risk management across. And then there's no way out. People have to kind of fall into that, right?
Yeah, and so we're on that journey right now in terms of, this is our first year where we're actually embedding risk management into the strategy formation or refresh process. Historically, what has happened is we've come in at the end. And so then what that means is now we're looking at risks of what the strategy is versus sort of helping drive those decisions. So the strategy incorporates those risks into into it. So it's helping drive the strategy versus, hey, we're coming in going, here's the problems or the risks associated with the strategy. So it's been quite a journey. It's been really, really interesting. And I would say risk management and audit services are now at the table in the strategy sessions, which we hadn't had before. So this is, it's best practice. We need to be there, but it's also, it's part of our journey. So.
Great. Thanks, Jen. And we've got several questions coming up, which I think I can hit pretty quickly. So first question is, how is the committee created different from a strategy session of the board? So the committee of the whole, I think, is the one you're talking about, the strategy and risk committee of the whole. So we already had a strategy and risk committee. And what it primarily did was it received reports on what the risk management team was doing. So that was a big part of the terms of reference. They also received updates on implementation of the strategic plan, like the big one, the 3 to 5 year corporate strategy, which is the one that we're used to seeing at sort of the board level. So that was already in place. The way that the current strategy and risk committee of the whole is different from, say, a strategy session of the board is that we're focused more on those short-term strategic initiatives, those newly arising ones that are coming up in response to sort of macroeconomic conditions. Whereas a strategy session of the board, which we do still hold once a year, is really looking at that longer term 3 to 5 year corporate strategy. And it's a little bit more blue sky, and it's definitely at a higher level, like a 40,000 foot level. We got our question too about who presided over as the chair for the strategy and risk committee of the whole. And for a while, we maintained the same chair that we had had in the past, who had more of a risk focus. But recently, we've actually switched out that chair to the board chair. So under our bylaws, our board chair is permitted to also act as a committee chair. And so he is now presiding over the strategy and risk committee of the whole. Both chairs worked very effectively, though. So I wouldn't, put any emphasis on that. Is there a pack of material that members have before the meeting? Yes, every time, at least a week ahead. In terms of oversight of the risk management program, is this with a committee or the board? It's with a committee, but it's with this strategy and risk committee of the whole. So the whole board is sitting around the table and getting the reports. So that actually helps to inform, all the questions that the board members might have about the various strategic initiatives. They're all of them have perspective on risk management and where we're at as an organization. I don't know if you want to speak to that as well, Jen.
Yeah, I would just say that I report directly into the risk chair of the strategy and risk committee as a whole. And I think that provides, well, what it does is it sort of provides that layer of independence, which is pretty critical, I would say, in identifying or sort of surfacing risks. It also, I would say, is leading best practice in terms of risk management. And we operate very similar to audit services, but that would be the only thing that I would add, Chris.
Okay, great. And thank you, Dan, for the kudos on the presentation. Does anyone else have any questions? We don't have anything else in the chat, but do feel free to come off mic.
I don't see anything yet.
We're almost at time. We
Yes.
worked it pretty well.
Yeah, we did.
And I hope this was useful for a variety of organizations. I know we have people joining us who are from the private sector, public sector, nonprofit, profit. We hope that just having some new ideas and fresh ideas and being open to ideas that may come at you from your board chair, from other members of your board, from management, to help deal with these, unprecedented times. I think it's staying open and thinking in terms of, well, how could this work and what are the pros and cons is really critical. I think that's the one thing I would hope that you would take away.
And I echo Chris's comments. So thanks for having us. It was a lot of fun in delivering the webinar to you guys. And at the beginning, Chris sort of, sent out our contact information. So please feel free to contact us.
Yeah, things often come up after the talk as well. I know once you've been thinking about it.
Thank you, Christine and Jennifer, for sharing all of your knowledge and expertise on this topic. It was very informative. And
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
No problem. And I would also like to thank everyone for joining us here today. Please be sure to register for our next CPD webinar, which is scheduled for Wednesday, March 8th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Dr. William Holmes will be discussing board composition and director selection. And our next deep session is scheduled for March 28th. So I'd just like to wish everyone a great day. Hope to see you at the next webinar.